of the students who were there, 1962, Kay is the one that I've kept in contact with for the last 55 years. So let's see if this works. Yeah, my topic is, can human populations be stabilized? And an alternative title would be, will human populations be limited by food? And as Kay said, I am an atmospheric scientist. I do research on clouds, snow, and sea ice, so I need to explain why I've taken an interest in population dynamics. It came about because I've been teaching a large undergraduate course on climate and climate change, and human population is a topic in that course. There are two ways in which human population is relevant for climate. First, it's important for the forcing of climate change, predicting emissions of greenhouse gases. We need to know how many people are going to be burning fossil fuels. And secondly, for the impacts of climate change, for example, sea level rise. Consider Bangladesh, a low-lying country about half the size of Oregon, and the effects of sea level rise are going to depend very much on the population of that country, whether it was 80 million as in 1975 or 160 million in 2015, or might be 200 million in 2050. We're going to start out testing your intuition on population growth. Well, first of all, exponential growth can occur in populations, or exponential decay. It results mathematically when the change in a quantity is proportional to the quantity itself. And that applies to populations of animals, plants, or bacteria. They're capable of growing exponentially because the number of offspring is proportional to the current population. Exponential growth normally does not continue for many generations because at some point the supply of an essential resource becomes limiting. And we're going to test your intuition, we're going to take this very isolated example. This is a small island, Easter Island, a small island in the eastern Pacific, far from any other land. And we're going to look at, we're going to say it was uninhabited until about the year 600, when somewhere between 20 and 30 Polynesians arrived in 2 big canoes. So just to pick an even number, we'll say 24. And after 1,000 years, by the year 1600, the population had grown to 6,000, and that was too many for that small island. Resulted in deforestation, famine, war, and cannibalism. And so we're going to work out what birth rate was necessary to lead to a disaster of that magnitude. So we're going to work out the relation of fertility rate to growth rate. What we mean by fertility rate is the number of children that each couple had. We're going to simplify it by just asking how many children that reached reproductive age. So ignoring the childhood deaths, how many children would you have to make per couple that would reach reproductive age and continue to reproduce themselves in order for the population to grow from 24 to 6,000. So this is not a historical question. There's argument about the dates, about the numbers, probably fluctuations in population. But we're just going to say mathematically, suppose it was just a steady exponential growth and there was no change in life expectancy, no change in the generation time, the average age of the mother when her middle child is born, we'll call that, say that's 25. That's oops, where was I? Okay, I got caught somehow. Oh, right, I know what's going on. Right, so here we are, that's the button to push, yeah. So you're going to make a guess. How many children that reach reproductive age did each couple produce on average during those 1,000 years? Yeah, So first, we need to say that, a fertility rate of 2, if the couple has 2 children that survive, then they're just replacing themselves. So the population would be stable with 2 children per couple. So we know they must have been having more than 2. So now, make a guess. Write down your guess, and it doesn't have to be an integer, but now I want you to round it off to the nearest integer. And we're going to take a poll. Okay, so anybody who has not read my paper, doesn't already know the answer, is allowed to vote. Okay, so how many think they were having 8 or more children? Anybody? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How many think 7? 7? 6? 5, 4, 3, 2. Does anybody think 2? If you think so, raise your hand high. Nobody? Okay, so quite a diversity of answers, and the correct answer is actually 2.3 and rounds off to 2. So now we're going to go through it's pretty simple math to get to that answer. Okay, so now I have to prove it to you. Right, okay, the population grew from 24 to 6,000, that's a factor of 250, which is approximately 2 to the 8th power. So that means the population doubled 8 times. So from 24, 1 doubling, take it to 48, another to 96, and after 8 doublings, multiply by 2, 8 times, you get to 6,000. So the population had to double 8 times, and it did that in 1,000 years. So if you had 8 doublings in 1,000 years, then how long does it take for 1 doubling? Well, 125 years, which is 5 generations. Population doubled in 5 generations, so in 1 generation, it increases by the 5th root of 2, which is 1.15. You take 1.15, you multiply it by itself 5 times, you get to 2. So after 5 generations, you've doubled the population. And so for a couple of 2, then you increase by 15%, and so it's 2.3. 2 times 1.15. So that surprised me, and I think I guessed something like 6 or 8 when I first read about Easter Island, and I was wrong. The students were wrong in my class, just like you, and the point of this exercise is to show you that the mathematics of exponential growth are not intuitive. So let's make a table here of what we were showing, that if you start, the population in the year 600 was 24, total fertility rate, if it was 2, meaning this is the number of children that reach reproductive age, it doesn't double, and the population stays at 24. If it's 2.3, then you have a doubling time of 125 years, and you get to 6,000. Now, some of you, a lot of you chose 4, Well, if you have 4 children, that means you're doubling in each generation. It means each generation has twice as many as the previous generation. So the population doubles in 1 generation, 25 years. So in 1,000 years, there'd be 40 doublings, and that comes out to be 24 trillion. Okay, so, right, so it's non-intuitive. Now, let's go from what happened long ago at Easter Island to what's happening now worldwide. The recent population history, the world population doubled in 40 years, from 3 billion in 1960 to 6 billion in 2000. The US population took longer to double. It was 150 million in 1950 and 300 million in 2006, 56 years. So we've all experienced this, this doubling from 1960 to 2000. We were all, I think, around in 1960. So was that unusual to double in 40 years? Well, yes, it was unusual because, in previous centuries, did the doubling take longer than 40 years? Well, to grow from 2 people to 6 billion people would require 32 doublings. And at 40 years per doubling, it would only take 1,280 years. But we know that there were more than 2 people on Earth 1,280 years ago. In the year, 720, there were more than 2 people. So we're in an unusual time, and this is a quote from Joel Cohen's book. Within the lifetime of some people now alive, world population has tripled. Within the lifetime of everyone over 40 years old, it has doubled. Yet never before the last half of the 20th century had world population doubled within the lifespan of any human. And that tripling applies to me and Kay. We were born in 1945. The population was 2.4 billion, and now it's more than 3 times that. So should we be surprised to find ourselves alive at this peculiar time? Actually, no, and here's the argument. If you're a randomly placed human, and if all centuries of the past million years were equally likely, then the chance of living in this century is only 1 chance in 10,000. But if instead we list all 75 billion humans who have ever lived in the order of their birth dates, and then you choose one of those humans randomly to be you, the chance is 8% that you'd be alive today. So for a human to be alive this time is more probable than any other time. And I got that from this paper by Richard Gott, Implications of the Copernican Principle for Our Future Prospects, that 7.7% of all people who've ever lived are alive today, so you should not be surprised to be born in an epoch with problems of overpopulation. Here's some numbers. This was from a world atlas that from the 1920s, and the world population then was 1.7 billion. And then I started subscribing in 1975 to the world population data sheet, and at that time it was 4 billion. And now it's over 7 billion. Where are the people? Well, they're really where the land is. They're in the northern hemisphere, 87%. And this is India and China, and this is North Africa. Southern hemisphere only 13% because it's mostly just ocean. And where, as percentages, Asia has 60%, Africa 14%, Europe 11%, Latin America 9%, US and Canada 5%, and so on. And the projections for 2050 are not much change except between Africa and Europe, that Africa is likely to become more prominent and Europe declining, although we're already seeing some movement, migration of Africans into Europe. Now here's the recent history for the last 100 years or so of world population on a logarithmic scale. So here's 1, 2, 4, 8. And on a logarithmic scale, exponential growth would be a straight line. And you see it's not a straight line. And the growth rate peaked in the 1960s at 2% per year. And since then, this growth rate's been declining. It's And in fact, it's declining just at the rate so that we're now experiencing, instead of exponential growth, we're experiencing steady growth. That every year, pretty much for the last 45 years, the annual increase in world population has been steady at about 80 million. So 1970, so this is the annual increment of global population. It's about 80 million a year. So we're getting steady growth rather than exponential growth because the growth rate is dropping. The base that you're multiplying the growth rate by is increasing, so it comes out to be a steady growth. Every year another 80 million, every 12 years another billion. And the way that comes about is we get 140 million births and 60 million deaths, so we have an additional 80 million in the population every year. Now, why has the growth rate been declining? It's because the number of children per woman has been declining. This is the, well, total fertility rate. The number of children per woman in different regions in Asia, Latin America. From the 1950s, it was around 6 and declined to between 2 and 3. North America and Europe, it's dropped to replacement level or below, less than 2 children in Europe. Africa really has not dropped very much, still very high birth rates. And subdividing Africa, we see that, North Africa and South Africa, the number of children has declined, but otherwise in Central Africa and East and West Africa, it's dropped a bit, but still around 6 children per woman. Now, the way these fertility rates are worked out, see what they are is the total number of children that a woman would bear during her lifetime. But we don't have to wait for her to go through all her childbearing years. Instead, the way it's done is that you survey all the women of different ages in each 5-year increment, and you get the births per 1,000 women per year, and that's plotted here for Japan, United States, and Chad. And then you integrate these curves and divide by 100, and you get the total, what's called the total fertility rate. So it's 1.3 in Japan, 2.1 in the US, and 6.3 in Chad. So what it is, it's actually the number of children that a woman would bear if she goes through her entire childbearing years in this 1 year, using the age-specific rates for the current year. Okay, so it's the average number of children a woman produces during her lifetime using the current rates for each age cohort. And you can relate that with a simple equation to the population doubling time, and what you need to know is the total fertility rate, the generation time, which we took to be 25 years in that example, and this one, which is the replacement level fertility. How many children do you need, do you need to produce to keep the population stable? And it's a little bit more than 2 because of childhood mortality. And this simple equation is not, it's really for a population that maintains the same total fertility rate over several generations, essentially 3 generations, 1 lifespan, and no change in life expectancy. Otherwise, you have what's called population momentum, and we'll see some examples of that later on. But it's a useful formula that I give to students to do calculations, so it's good for homework problems. And it's good for just thinking about the problem. So, as we said, if children do not die before reproductive age, the replacement level fertility would be 2 children per woman. And now in countries with low mortality, it's 2.1 or 2.06 for the US and in Europe and Australia and Japan. So it's a little bit over 2. And then there are these simple results, some of which we already saw. If children do not die before reproductive age, then replacement level fertility is 2. And then you have these really simple examples. If it's 2, population stays constant. If it's 4, population doubles in 1 generation. If it's 1, population halves in 1 generation. And right now, the highest fertility rates are in Africa, 6 to 8 children per woman, and the lowest are in Eastern Europe and East Asia, 1.2. So let's focus in on this. Let's focus in on an example where the population is doubling in one generation. And that's in the Philippines. The population doubled every 28 years. In 1900, the population of the Philippines was 7 million, and now it's 100 million. And to do that, growth from 7 to 100 required 4 doublings, factor of 16, so it doubled 4 times, and now it's 100 million. That's what happens when you double in each generation. Now, the United Nations Population Division is responsible for making projections of future populations, and they are wrong. Here's an example. In 1951, the UN predicted the population of 1980, and they predicted that it would be 3.3 billion, and it turned out in 1980 actually to be 4.4 billion. In spite of the past failures, the UN has gone ahead and made projections for the next 3 centuries to the year 2300. This is a book published in 2004, a 240-page book with tables for each country at 50-year intervals showing the male to female ratios, the male and female life expectancies, the population of each age group, and so on. I'm going to show you some figures from this book. Okay, this is for Europe, showing the total fertility in 4 regions of Europe starting 1950 to 2000. Well, the fertility rate was already dropping, but it continued to drop between 1950 and 2000, now down to below replacement level, down below 2, and it's called the demographic transition, the decline in fertility rate. And now, given that history, what would you predict for the future for these rates? Think about now, what would you think is going to happen in the next 100, 200 years? Is this what you would predict? Well, this is what the UN projected, that the fertility rates will recover to 2.1 and remain stable exactly at 2.1 for the indefinite future. Well, we know that negative or stabilizing feedbacks are required for such stability. You need a feedback if it gets more than 2.1, something to bring it back down, and some process to bring it back up if it's below 2.1. And those feedbacks have been searched for. This was a review article by Paul Demeny, who quoted 11 prominent demographers who were searching for these feedbacks, and they could not find them. So he concludes there is no magic force that guarantees stability of fertility behavior once replacement level is reached. Well, so what if it doesn't recover in Europe to 2.1? Suppose, for example, that they just stayed stable at the value for 2004. Then what would happen? Well, the report did consider that possibility and said, here's the projection for the year 2300 at current fertility rates. About half the countries of Europe would lose 95% or more of their population, and such countries as Russian Federation and Italy would have only 1% of their population left. Although one might entertain the possibility that fertility will never rise above current levels, the consequences appear sufficiently grotesque as to make this seem improbable. So this is the argument from grotesqueness. Okay, another figure from this book compares the 2 countries on Earth that have the highest and the lowest fertilities, Niger with 8 children and Latvia with 1. And the projection to the year 2300 is that they will rapidly converge to be equal at 2.1 for the indefinite future. So Niger is projected to have a demographic transition like happened in Europe or like happened in China in the last few decades. So I'm trying to identify the logic of the UN's report. So step number 1 is replacement level fertility is 2.1. That's a fact. And well, for developed countries it is. And number two, stability of population is desirable. Well, that's an assertion. And step number three, therefore, all nations will converge to total fertility of 2.1. And in the terminology of logic, I think there's a name for this kind of argument, but I'll just call it wishful thinking. Now that was 2004. What has happened since then? Well, what has the UN been doing? Well, this is from 2012, and they're still using 2.1. Well, actually fluctuating around an equilibrium value taken to be 2.1, which is set by expert judgment since there are not enough data to estimate it. 2014, this was, yeah, showing this is what they're predicting to happen to these countries with high fertility. There will be this phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. They'll come to somewhere around 2, and approximate fertility level of 2.1 for all countries in phase 3. So, 2.1 children per woman. Why is this assumption so persistent? Well, I think we can get a clue from another figure that's also in the UN's book, which shows the predicted, or the future population, not predicted, but what it would be under constant fertility starting immediately in 2004. So this is population in billions going from 0 up to 40, and if you immediately change to 2.1, there's a little bit of momentum, but then eventually you stabilize the population. Now, if you have a quarter of a child less or a quarter of a child more, then you don't stabilize. If you have a quarter of a child less, then the population of the world eventually declines towards 0. And if it's a quarter of a child more, the population grows toward infinity. And both of those scenarios would appear disastrous. And so to avoid disaster, you keep total fertility rate at 2.1. And I think we would agree that avoiding disaster is admirable, but avoiding disaster by wishful thinking, maybe not. Okay, well, the UN's latest projections from, were publicized by this widely quoted article in Science magazine. It was a collaboration of the UN workers and some workers in the statistics department at the University of Washington, where I work. And you can see they're using 2.1 again. And so Adrian Raftery is the leader of the group in the University of Washington. And when I gave this talk in my department in Seattle, he was in the audience. And after my talk, he came up and told me that the UN workers were upset with my statement that I published, that the UN projections were based on a logical fallacy. I encouraged him and his UN colleagues to publish a comment on my paper, but they never did. I even had drafted my response to what I guessed their comment would be. Now, there is another group that is challenging those projections. There's a group from Austria, and they think that the fertility rate will not level off at 2.1, that it will drop more rapidly and come to a lower level, somewhere between 1.7 and 2.1. So let's have a look. Let's see if we can see who's winning in that debate. And we'll look at the example of Niger, what's happened to its fertility rate since 2004. But before we do that, I'm going to show you some pictures because I was in Niger in 1977. This is the children's clinic. This is the young mothers lined up waiting to have their babies immunized. At that time, there was still already need for food aid from the foreign countries, in this case from the US, and the population was 5 million. It's a mostly desert country and some semi-desert. And now the population is 20 million. And the projection for the year 2050 is 70 million, and the country cannot support 70 million people with its agriculture, at least not now. So let's go back now. I've expanded just 20 years of that graph. So just from the year 2000 to 2020, what the UN projection was that the fertility rate would drop along this line, and that by 2016 it would be down to 7. And the Austrian group thought it would drop more rapidly. And here's what it actually is in 2016. It's up at 7.6. So this phenomenon whereby the fertility rate is dropping more slowly than expected is so widespread in Africa that's been given a name. It's called the stall in fertility decline. And it's been attributed to a decline in international development assistance for family planning. Now I'm going to raise the question, did the UN cause harm by publishing this graph? And I do think that this report and this graph probably did some harm, falsely reassuring policymakers that there's no need to work hard to assist in family planning because it looks like population will take care of itself. Subsequently, this is a fairly recent publication by the UN. They've got some more detail about an update about their latest projections. And I've just pulled out the numbers for Niger. You know, it's in the Sahel in West Africa, just below the Sahara. And here are their projections for total fertility rate. They admit that now it is 7.6 and is projected to decline by the year 2100. But of course, during that time, it's more than 2, so the population is going to be growing. They're projecting the population to reach 200 million by the year 2100. And in spite of that, they're looking to a rosy future with life expectancy growing to 77 and the child mortality dropping by a factor of 10. And not everybody has such a rosy view of the future of Niger with 200 million people. So they're thinking that we need to reduce the fertility rate faster. And this is an article by John Bonegarts in Nature last year, arguing that we need to slow down population growth, and that in particular women everywhere should have access to quality contraceptive services, should not as a prediction but as a recommendation. He points out that there's an unsatisfied demand for contraception. There are women in these countries that don't want to have so many children, but they're unable to get contraception. It's called the unmet need for contraception. And he points out that only 1% of all overseas development assistance is now allocated to family planning. And he's arguing that that should be doubled, that there would be great benefit if that could be raised to 2%. And I agree. Now this, I should point out though that the unmet need for birth control is not just in the poor countries. In the United States, 45% of pregnancies are unintended. And because those pregnancies result in babies that grow up to burn fossil fuels, these authors argued that family planning is the most effective way for Americans to reduce their carbon dioxide emissions. They're talking about the carbon legacies of individuals. The idea is that you are responsible not only for your own emissions of carbon dioxide, but also for the emissions of your children and all your descendants, at least to the extent you're related to them, because you have the ability to prevent those emissions by choosing not to have a child. So they calculated it. They give an example for the US where, the summed emissions of a person's descendants weighted by their relatedness to him may far exceed the lifetime emissions by the original parents. They estimated that for the US, each child that you produce, it multiplies your own emissions by factor 5.7. And they compare all these various ways you might reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, energy efficiency, fuel economy, and so on. And by comparison, reducing the number of children by 1, depending on your emission scenario, far exceeds in any of the other ways that you could reduce your CO2 emissions. Okay, well, that's an aside. Let's now go back to something I pointed out earlier, that the birth rates have been dropping, and as of 2004, half of the world's population live in countries in which fertility is below replacement level. Why is that happening? Well, it seems to be related to education of mothers. So here's the fertility by the mother's education level. So here in Peru, no education, they're raising 5 children, primary 4, secondary 2.4, above secondary 1.8. So more educated women have fewer children. And correspond kind of as a positive feedback on this, if a society does have fewer children, then they're able to put more effort into education, and so it's a virtuous circle sort of thing. So it's been seen that there's this correlation between fertility rate and both affluence and education of girls, but the causality can go in both directions. You can have countries with fewer children to support are able to invest more in the education of those children. So this article by Lutz, one of the Austrians, under conditions of high population growth, the increase in school-age population is such that even maintaining the current school enrollment rates is an uphill battle. From a policy perspective, it is most effective to try to increase female education and improve access to family planning programs at the same time. So half the world's population live in countries in which fertility is below replacement level. Yes, that's an encouraging development, but, well, a couple of buts. One is that female literacy does not guarantee low fertility. There are other influences that can create growing subgroups. Now, we have 50 states in the US, and they all have different fertility rates. And which state do you think has the highest total fertility rate? Is 2.6 children per woman. Texas, Alabama, Utah is the right answer. And of course that that goes along with the dominant religion in Utah. Then another example is the Palestinian territory, where the girls get 12 years of schooling, but they're producing 4.1 children. Used to be 6 until recently, now it's 4.1. So this may be for political reasons. And small outlier groups can grow quickly. Just a few of these small groups, as long as they persist in their high fertility, they can grow quickly. So going back to this example I showed earlier, Philippines, the population doubled every 28 years, it doubled 4 times in 4 generations. And at this rate, after another 6 generations, or 6 doublings, it would grow to 7 billion. That's because 2 to the 10th power is 1,000, so you get 10 doublings, you get a factor of 1,000, you grow from 7 million to 7 billion. And 7 billion is about the current global population. So if the entire rest of the world would now immediately stop having children so that their societies would die out, it would take just 170 more years for descendants of this one outlier group to replace them all. And by the way, what the Philippines did in the 20th century, the US did in the 19th. Ben Franklin, in 1751, predicted the colonial population will double every 20 years. And Malthus, in his famous book about population, quoted Franklin, but he thought 20 years was too short. He thought it'd be more like 25 years. And Malthus was right. The population between 1800 and 1900 doubled every 25 years, doubled 4 times from 5 million to 76 million in 100 years. Okay, now let's go back. As we saw, nations vary greatly in their fertility rates, and here are the corresponding population pyramids comparing Italy and Nigeria. So what's plotted here is, this is a histogram on its side. This is the number of of people in different age groups. So this is 0 to 4, 5 to 9. So as you go up in age, males on the left, females on the right. So Nigeria shows the typical population structure of a country with high fertility. And so most of the population are young, whereas Italy has undergone a transition down to below replacement level. So there are successively fewer and fewer in each successive five-year age group. Now, Italy and Nigeria, actually Italy had more population than Nigeria in 1950, but now Nigeria is quite a bit more, and you can see what is, what the trend would be for the future. That over time, the low fertility countries will dwindle to irrelevance in population counts, so we should instead pay attention to the high fertility countries. And in this prominent paper by the UN group and the University of Washington group, they did focus on Nigeria because Nigeria has the largest, it is the most populous country in Africa. And their projection for Nigeria is that the fertility rate will drop, this is the fertility rate, function of year, from 6 down to, by the end of the century, down to 2.2 in the year 2100. But because, well, actually, let's just compare that. It looks like what they're doing is showing something like what happened in China, where in China it was 6 children per woman, except for the Great Leap Forward. And then in the 70s, it dropped. And then there was the one-child policy, and it dropped further, never down to 1, but down to less than 2 in the 80s and 90s. And so for Nigeria, they're projecting that it's going to do something similar, although not as fast as China. And of course, during this time, the fertility rate's greater than 2, so the population is going to be growing during the entire century. It's now 178 million. Projections are that it would get to 900 million by the year 2100. That's a large number. What if instead they went immediately to 2 instead of waiting for 100 years? Then the population would still grow because of momentum through this, because there's so many young people already through the century. Even if you dropped it to 1, start immediately, only one child, a one-child policy, it would still take about 40 years before the population would start to decline, just because of momentum, and then it would decline. So here's the median population projection for 2100, and can Nigeria's agriculture support 900 million? Well, certainly can't now, and will it in the year 2100? Maybe not, probably not. So there are 2 possibilities. People might starve, or instead they might migrate. And already 40% of the people in Nigeria want to emigrate to the West, according to a Gallup poll. And Europe is the nearest region of low fertility. In fact, on this map, this very colorful map, everything that's not red has a fertility rate below replacement level. And but some of them are growing even though they're not replacing themselves. They're growing because of immigration. Let's just focus in on the German-speaking countries. So what we have here is the natural increase, which is negative, meaning there were more deaths than births. But the net migration, this was in 2004, was greater than, more than compensated, so the population was growing. So the population of the German-speaking countries grew, even though the death rate exceeded the birth rate. This is back in 2004. This is before the recent immigration from Syria. Yeah, and this is an old map from a textbook, but it shows the sending countries in white, the receiving countries in black, where the migrants are coming from, going to. Looks like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh are all sending countries, but there's some, and not much going on in South Africa, but actually there's a lot nearby migration. You know, you probably read about the protests in South Africa against illegal immigrants coming in from Zimbabwe and Mozambique. And now let's go back. I showed you this before. Bangladesh. Well, maybe sea level rise is going to displace some people in Bangladesh. And what countries border Bangladesh? India and? No. Burma. Okay, has a small border with, just 2 countries, has a small border with Burma and a large border with India. And now, India is anticipating that there's going to be sea level rise, and that this is how much of, I guess, half a meter would flood this much of Bangladesh. So they're anticipating there's going to be pressure for migration. And so India is building a fence on the border of Bangladesh. And they've only got part of it done so far, but it's under construction. Just another minute, we'll take a break. There is a lot of debate in the rich countries that are aging and with low fertility about whether they need to bring in immigrants to do the work. When the old people retire, who's going to do the work? And this article concluded, on the contrary, moderately low fertility and population decline favor the broader material standard of living. If we compare, so in the US, 13% of the population are immigrants, in Germany, 12%, but in Japan, it's only 2%. Japan, its population is declining. It's had low fertility for so long, it's declining, and what are they doing about it? They're not bringing in immigrants. They think that would be disruptive to a harmonious society. So instead, they're getting retirees to come back to work, and they're getting a lot of work done by robots. And one example is in nursing homes, people with dementia. A lot of the services are being done by robots because the people are so demented they can't tell the difference between a robot and a human. Oh yeah, so what is the projection for 2100 by the UN? It's about 11 billion, and so go from 7 billion to 11 billion. Most of that's in Africa, to grow from 1 billion to 4 billion, the rest of the world by 1 billion. They do, in the fine print, point out that these projections do not take into account potential negative feedback from severe resource shortages. And I think it's important to distinguish negative feedback from a constraint. Negative feedback would mean that resource shortages cause people to have fewer children. On the other hand, they might have the children anyway, and the children would starve. In that case, the resource shortages would be a constraint on the population. Okay, so we'll now stop for questions and then take a break and then continue. Oh, yeah.
Steve, while we're waiting, it would seem like population, some sort of Planned Parenthood or planning the population would be a real plus in this day and age, in not only here but all around the country. What do you think?
Yeah, well, you'll see that later, and that's the only recommendation I have, is that there should be massive funding for worldwide for provision of contraception and abortion services. There's some claim that no country has reached replacement level, has dropped below replacement level without legalized abortion. So I think that may also be important.
Hi. Years ago, I read a very, very good book by a Canadian ethnobiologist by the name of Paul Collinvaux. And I don't know if he's still around. But anyway, he talks about many of the same things that you just discussed about. But he talked about it in terms of something called niche space, which is the amount of resources, whether it's education, economic, living space, whatever, required for successful reproduction of a population unit, meaning a couple. And it just seems to me, then the question really is, among the statistics that you have, apart from education, it's the economic portion that is going to control whether or not a couple has the resources to go ahead and have children. So in all of this stuff that you put up on there, the UN stuff, did they discuss actual economics in terms of how are people going to be able to survive?
No, well, the thing is that, and I'll get to this in one of my conclusions, that the UN, there are things that could be put into the modeling of resources, trade, and education, and also climate change and agriculture, but it seems that, I'm going to make recommendations. I mean, if I'm criticizing the UN, I need to make recommendations what they should do. And so I started out thinking that I'd recommend that they, do, well, you'll see what my recommendations are. But I think that kind of thing the UN can't do. The population division at the UN is under such political pressure from about 200 countries that they're not free to just write everything they think. They have to really stick to what they're assigned.
Hi. Well, is it working? We're back. I think this poses a moral dilemma. What is the obligation of affluent countries to assist in feeding and disease prevention and peacekeeping in countries with burgeoning populations?
Well, there is so-called development aid. Fortunately, it's not just the U.S. There are other countries, largely in Europe, that are, that are sending people and funding development aid. We need a lot more of it. I mean, we're wealthy enough we could afford to, we've got a lot of military aid going to other countries. Take a small part of that and put it into helping the societies in these poor countries that have high birth rates.
But then, aren't we aiding the expansion of population?
Yes, by what's called death control, by bringing in immunizations and sanitation and killing mosquitoes and allowing the children to be to grow up. If you had 8 children and 6 of them died in childhood, then the population is not growing. But if they're not dying in childhood, and the replacement level fertility varies between 2.1 and 2.9. The highest is 2.9 in some of the poorest countries that are in war and so on, but it's not anywhere near 6. So yeah, back in the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s, really, really more in the 40s and 50s, I guess, there was a lot of discussion about this and claims that that if we're going to provide death control to these countries, then they in turn have to reciprocate by providing birth control. But that didn't happen. Now there is this so-called unmet need that can be addressed anyway. I mean, there are women, even women who don't, when you ask them how many children they would like, what they say may be the number they have, just because their mother-in-law is listening. And so, but when you actually offer them, I've been in communication with this group at Berkeley in the public health school that is working in the Sahel in Niger. They're on the front line. And they say that when they make contraceptives available to these women, these illiterate women, they immediately, eagerly take them up. Probably not enough to drop it to replacement level. So Yeah, I'm a pessimist about the future.
This is George. About 30 years ago, Meadows and Meadows produced a book called Limits to Growth, an analysis of population growth, pollution, resource capabilities, agriculture production, and other indices that affect population. Have there been any studies done like that since then? They have pretty dire projections.
Yeah, for many years there wasn't, but now there is. There's starting to be there's a group in University of Maryland that's working on that. They've just come out with a couple of papers, and the sort of integrated modeling. So they can do it a lot better now than they could then, and the predictions are still dire. Well, probably more dire now, because the population back then was 4 billion, and now it's more than 7.
Well, I know there's more questions, but why don't we take our break now, and we can save those questions for the second half. Back in 10 minutes.
Oh, here's a question for you to think about. Why is the human population growing? Well, so, I give a homework assignment to the students to do all these calculations, but then I asked them to do a couple of essay questions, 2 essay questions. This is the first one. Why is the human population growing? And the first time I asked this question, a number of the students wrote because people have more than 2 children. And so the next time I taught the class, I included within the question a warning that this is not an acceptable answer. Because, why is it not an acceptable answer? Because the same can be said for all other animal species, and most of their populations are not growing. Squirrels, rabbits, spiders, birds, they all produce more than 2 offspring in a lifetime, and yet their populations are not growing. A robin doesn't lay just 2 eggs in her lifetime. She lays 4 eggs every year. And yet the population of robins can remain stable because the population is limited by food supply or predators, or maybe disease. Well, why does she lay more than 2 eggs? It's because a fertility rate less than 2 means a declining population, and the parents can't be sure that both children will survive to reproduce. So to be sure of perpetuating their species, they produce more than 2, often far more than 2, and they let the limit be set by something else, food supply or predators. Any species that had less than 2 offspring, they already went extinct or they're now going extinct. So the ones that we're left with have more than 2. So humans are nothing unusual. It's just normal for animals to have more than 2 offspring. Nothing unusual about having more than 2. So the question can be rephrased. What is permitting the human population to grow? And the answer was given by this article by Vaclav Smil titled Detonator of the Population Explosion. And he singled out nitrogen fertilizers. He says, without ammonia, there would be no inorganic fertilizers. Nearly half the world would go hungry. Artificial ways of taking nitrogen from the atmosphere and so-called fixing nitrogen, putting it into nitrate or ammonia so that it could be taken up by plants. And I actually have an opportunity to show a figure from my own father's PhD thesis, 1945, where this is corn. On the left, low nitrogen. On the right, high nitrogen. So Smil pointed out about half the protein in human bodies, including your human body, got its nitrogen from the Haber-Bosch synthesis of ammonia. So this was invented by Haber and Bosch in Germany in the around 1910 or so, and actually became the cheapest way to fix nitrogen. And there were mines, nitrate mines in the Atacama Desert that then went out of business. So I've been in northern Chile and seen some of these ghost towns that used to mine nitrate. But now it's the Haber-Bosch process, and the world's population could not have grown from 1.6 billion in 1900 to today's 6 billion. So that was in 1999, without the Haber-Bosch process and other technical progress in agriculture. So world population has been growing for most of the last 10,000 years, and the reason it's growing is agriculture. And this is what Malthus said, although he didn't expect agriculture to progress as fast as it did. Here was just a summary of Malthus' idea or argument. In 1915, Malthus looked upon population as a great force gathered behind a movable barrier, which was the food supply. As this barrier was moved ahead and left an open space, population proceeded to fill up this open space. If the barrier were removed rapidly, the population would increase rapidly. I guess that's the frontier of the US West. And if it were moved slowly, population would increase slowly, and always those close to the barrier would be in distress, and the fear of being pressed close to the barrier would keep many others from having as large families as they would like to have. Now, actually, there's more to the story besides agriculture, because in the centuries before 1800, global population was growing, but it was not growing so rapidly. The total fertility rate was slightly greater than the replacement level fertility, so it was growing, but they were both not that different, and maybe around 6 with a question mark. The growth accelerated in the 1900s. So why has the recent population growth been so rapid? Well, actually, we heard some of this in one of the questions, and that is that at first the total fertility rates remained high, but the replacement level fertility decreased because child mortality decreased. And that was particularly in this 50-year period, 1880-1930, in Europe and North America, because of public sanitation, better transportation, allowing food to be distributed more efficiently, which allowed better nutrition, childhood immunization, and then insecticides against malaria mosquitoes in the low latitude countries. And now the global average of all the people in the world, is now down to 2.3. And yet the fertility rate is quite a bit higher. And agriculture has kept up with the growing population so far. And there are several ways that the food supply could be increased further. One is another paper by Václav Smil. It's a Czech name. Without increasing the area of farmland and without increasing the yields, just by increasing efficiencies with higher fertilizer uptake, reduced irrigation rate, reduced post-harvest losses, the rats eating the grain and so on, healthier diets, limit fat intake, then we could have a gain of 60%. So the population was in 1994, when this paper was written, was 5.3, and he said it could grow to 8.4 billion. On the other hand, there's also land, potentially arable land. So this is in developing countries in 1989, showing that only about a third of the potentially arable land was actually being used for agriculture. And then yields have increased. This is actually the last paper by my father, showing actually on a log scale. So 1, 2, 4, 8, 16. So a straight line would be exponential growth. And since 1930 to 2000, there have been spectacular increases in the yield, so per hectare, of several crops in the US. And also, a lot of this has happened elsewhere in the world. On the other hand, we're facing a threat that is just getting started, which is global warming. We're just seeing the beginnings of it now. But there's a risk, and probably the yields are going to go down with warmer climate. Here's an example from the Philippines comparing the yield of rice in different years. So this is, right, this is a temperature. This is temperature and grain yield, or temperature and above ground biomass. And each point is a year. So in different years, the annual temperature was different. It didn't vary all that much, but some years it was 22 Celsius up to 23.5. And you can see that with the higher temperatures, you're getting less biomass and you're getting less yield. And that's also been shown for corn in Mexico. Okay, well, the other essay question I asked the students, besides what's causing the population to grow, now what will stop it? What will stop population growth? So now we have the birth rate exceeding the death rate. And so either we'll have a decline in the birth rate or a rise in the death rate until they're equal. And so I tabulated the results for 68 predictions. Now, admittedly, they did this essay question after they had heard me give some lectures about population. So decrease in the birth rate by 25 of them, voluntary, by coercion, or accidental. You know what that accidental would be? Yeah, you've probably heard that these estrogen mimics in water pollution causing reduced sperm counts. That's what that would be. Accidental decrease in the birth rate. Increase in the death rate, pollution, disease, war, depletion of resources, which might be related to lack of food. So I'm kind of inclined to go with this kind of majority or plurality. I think war and disease are less likely to limit population growth, and I'll show why. Oh, and then there was one student who thought the population would not stop growing. He said, we'll colonize other planets, other solar systems, other galaxies, and the universe is expanding. Then I worked out another homework problem about how long that would take. Anyway, the reason I don't think war will do it, war has temporary effects. Here's the population of Rwanda. It was, in 1950, it was 2 million and grew rapidly. And by 1994, it was up to 8 million and resulted in competition for land that resulted in the massacres. 1 million people were killed. 1 million people were killed, but within a few years after that, the population had already exceeded the pre-war value. And in fact, the fertility rate went up after the war, and it was, some called it revenge fertility. Okay, well, what did limit population growth in the past, before agriculture? Were the pre-agricultural societies starving? Malthus and his successors thought that the population was not always limited by famine, and nor even by war or disease, and the population was often intentionally limited by various methods of birth control: postponement of marriage, abstention from intercourse, prolonged lactation, which makes women infertile as long as they're lactating normally, and abortion and infanticide. Now, those of you who've read Malthus's essay will remember that the word vice appears over and over again, but he never defines it. What does he mean by vice? Well, he was kind of sometimes reluctant to say things right out. And he did include, though, abortion and infanticide would be among the things that he called vice. That vice is one way you could limit population. Of course, the methods of abortion were quite primitive and sort of brutal. And then actually Margaret Sanger and the other promoters of birth control, of contraception, were arguing that that's what we need so that we can reduce the incidence of these brutal methods of reduced births. Now, some conclusions. but I'll still have some more things to say. Hopefully, the birth rate will decline worldwide to replacement level or below in response to increased availability of contraception and abortion to satisfy women's desire for birth control. However, even if such efforts are implemented with massive funding, the goal of a stable or declining world population may not be achieved. Even if most societies do complete a transition to low fertility, the few that do not will grow to dominate the world's demographic future as the low fertility groups gradually die out. Assuming that migration is possible. And in evolutionary theory, that's what's called the competitive exclusion principle. So if fertility is not reduced to replacement level or below everywhere, then the human population will continue to grow, I guess this is my prediction, until it reaches a limit set by food supply, which in turn may be limited by water, energy, pollution, social infrastructure. So that could be important. I mean, if you have breakdown of society, if you have civil wars, that really can cause just problems in the distribution of food that make, even if agriculture could be enough, just getting the food to the people could be difficult, or even getting the farmers to their fields. So that's a big one. Or climate change, may be enhanced though by genetic engineering. So there is quite a possibility for increased food supply by genetic engineering. And just on kind of an aside, but I did give a talk to the astronomers at University of Washington, and a lot of you have probably heard of SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And the question is, why has SETI failed so far? We have not gotten signals from any other intelligent species in the galaxy. And a leading explanation for that is that maybe technological civilizations have short lifetimes. Short lifetimes because of the kind of things I've been talking about. What happens to population when you've developed agriculture? So this group, one of our former students, Jacob Hockmisra, argued, well, maybe there's a solution to this, that maybe there's some societies that become sustainable. That, so he's saying that, you know, he's arguing against the idea that intelligent civilizations inevitably destroy themselves by saying that, if unsustainable practices of human civilization could lead to global scale collapse, and then human civilization would not be able to colonize the galaxy. But all hope is not lost for human civilization. There are many documented cases of human populations managing their resources sustainably and achieving long-term survival. Okay, many, sure, there are many, but not all. And so my argument that I didn't publish, but I wrote to him, even on a planet where most populations are not, as he called, expansive, meaning that their fertility rate exceeds the replacement level, then the one renegade group that is expansive will crowd out all the others. I doubt that cultural diversity can be suppressed completely. Occasionally, groups will arise that have birth rates higher than replacement level. And that's why I'm pessimistic about the future. So the relevance to the SETI, number one, evolution is universal. Secondly, renegade groups will arise on all habitable planets. Now, maybe they could be suppressed. Maybe you could have such a controlling government that it prevents any outlier from getting to grow in population. But then you have to have an unlimited duration of governments, and governments don't last all that long. You know, they get overthrown. So societies will grow in population until limited by food supply and then collapse to subsistence level. Alternatively, if all societies of the intelligent species lower their fertility to below replacement level, then the species goes extinct. Okay, now another question. We now have 7 billion. Was that inevitable? Was it inevitable that world population would eventually at some time, maybe not as fast as it did, but at some time would reach today's 7 billion or 7.4 billion? Are there any plausible policies that could conceivably have been put in place a century or two ago to limit the ultimate population to 2 or 3 billion? And would such policies survive beyond the typical lifetime of governments? Well, there was a lot of discussion about this in the early 1900s. During 1900 and 1937, when the world population was about 2 billion, there were numerous international conferences on how to stop population growth so as to prevent war. There was a consensus that the Great War of 1914 to 18 was caused by overpopulation in Europe. They also feared for the future. They were looking at Japan, and they saw the extremely high density of population in Japan, together with restrictions on immigration of Japanese to Australia and America. They were worried that that was going to cause Japan to try to annex neighboring lands, which of course it did. So they wanted to find ways to stop population growth and limit it to 2 billion, and they failed. Okay, some summary things to remember. For the last 45 years, world population has increased steadily by about 80 million every year because the growth rate is decreasing. UN population projections are based on a logical fallacy. Fertility rates in Africa have been declining more slowly than expected. They say it's stalled. There's nothing unusual about having more than 2 children. It's normal for all animal species. So the cause of human population growth is advances in agriculture. And agriculture is in a race to keep up with the growing population. So now, as I said, I need to make recommendations for the UN if I'm going to criticize them. So instead of making population projections based on optimistic assumptions of fertility and mortality, what would be good would be to analyze the links and the feedbacks among population, food production, world trade, migration, climate change, water, energy, diseases, all of that. But then on second thought, as I said, I think that this is probably more a project for universities and research institutes, not for the UN, because they have the political pressures that prevent them from really free thinking in this way. So another thing the UN could do, though, is to identify 2.1 as a goal for a total fertility rate. And then in different countries, identify policies for each country that would push the fertility rate toward that goal. And they've sort of done that in identifying these so-called sustainable development goals, many of which would lead to lower population growth, no poverty, zero hunger, quality education, gender equality, and these goals are certainly good goals, but are they going to happen? These articles saying that meeting them would lead to lower world population growth pointed out, this is by the Austrian group again, that they're ambitious and with a qualification if they're actually pursued. It's an aspiration to mount a historically unprecedented effort to change the course of global development. And their target year is 2030, which is just 13 years from now. Yeah. Maybe okay, I guess it takes a while, but maybe I'll read this quote. It was the last page of Joel Cohen's book. He quoted John Stuart Mill, 1848, when world population was about 1 billion. It's fairly small print, but I'll read it to you. There is room in the world, no doubt, and even in old countries, for a great increase of population, supposing the arts of life to go on improving and capital to increase. But even if innocuous, I confess I see very little reason for desiring it. The density of population necessary to enable mankind to obtain in the greatest degree all the advantages both of cooperation and of social intercourse has in all the most populous countries been attained. A population may be too crowded, though all be amply supplied with food and raiment. It is not good for man to be kept perforce at all times in the presence of his species. A world from which solitude is extirpated is a very poor ideal. Solitude, in the sense of being often alone, is essential to any depth of meditation or of character, and solitude, in the presence of natural beauty and grandeur, is the cradle of thoughts and aspirations which are not only good for the individual, but which society could ill do without. Nor is there much satisfaction in contemplating the world with nothing left to the spontaneous activity of nature, with every rood of land brought into cultivation, which is capable of growing food for human beings, every flowery waste or natural pasture plowed up, all quadrupeds or birds which are not domesticated for man's use, exterminated as his rivals for food. Every hedgerow or superfluous tree rooted out, and scarcely a place left where a wild shrub or flower could grow without being eradicated as a weed in the name of improved agriculture. If the earth must lose that great portion of its pleasantness which it owes to things that the unlimited increase of wealth and population would extirpate from it, for the mere purpose of enabling it to support a larger but not a better or happier population, I sincerely hope, for the sake of posterity, that they will content to be stationary long before necessity compels them to it. Okay, well, finally, I'm going to give you a recommendation for your book club. This is a very readable book by Alan Weissman, about what are the possibilities for population decline. He has a chapter about each of these 12 different countries. He goes to each of these 12 countries: Costa Rica, Britain, Uganda, China, Philippines, Niger, Pakistan, Iran, Israel, Japan, India, Thailand. They're all different in how their populations are going and what their policies are. So I can recommend that book. Then this very short article, it's only a couple pages, recommend that one, the Nature article by John Bonegarts. And then there's a couple of new books which I'm in the process of reading that are probably not for your book club. They're maybe too dense. Intellectual Histories by Alison Bashford. This one is called The New Worlds of Thomas Robert Malthus. So it's looking at what Malthus knew about the new discoveries by explorers in North America, Australia, and the Philippines, and what were the practices of the Aboriginal peoples in those three regions. How did they limit their populations? So he was very interested in that. I'm learning about that. And the one that I just recently finished was this book, Global Population, History, Geopolitics, and that is about the period of 1900 to 1940 or 50, when there was a huge, much more interest or publicity about interest in population than there is now, actually. And then I can, there's my own paper that was published 2 years ago that says a lot of what I said today. Well, I guess that's all I have, so we can have questions now.
This is Charlene. As you have been talking, I've been thinking about the most publicized country in the world probably that tried to limit population, and that's China. Could you speak to that and what they did and why they did away with it and what their future is looking like?
Yeah, actually, I guess I've got a... Oh, well, I did show you one figure from China, yeah, about the history of the fertility rate. It's quite interesting. During the 50s and 60s, when Mao was in charge, he really wanted the population to grow, and he encouraged high fertility, and so it was around 6 children per woman. And then it was, by the time, I guess when Mao died, or maybe somewhat before, they were noticing, uh-oh, we're in trouble. We've got too many people because of this boom in population. You know, it wasn't that long ago, China had only 100 million, and it would be a manageable country with 100 million people, but it is so unwieldy now with 1.3 billion that they went to this. Well, they first, in the 1970s, they just went to policies to encourage lower fertility. They were not coercive, but they were encouragements. And the fertility rate dropped from 6 down actually almost, to like 2 point something. And then they instituted the one-child policy in 1979, after the fertility rate had already dropped quite a lot. So the one-child policy probably wasn't necessary. You know, over in Taiwan, which is also Chinese, without any such policy, the fertility rate is down to 1.2. It's even lower than on the mainland now. But this did go on for a long time, this one-child policy, and it wasn't applied universally. There are minority groups in China that were still allowed to have more children. And 5%, I think, of the population, which means 50 million people, were in minority groups that could continue to have, be unlimited. But this, among the urban population, it's gotten to be a cultural norm that it's considered patriotic to have only one child. And so it maybe would even be sustainable as an ethic, which would be good if we could reduce the population. But now they're getting worried about the aging of the population. And where they've had this period of amazing economic growth because they've had so many people in the middle ages, the working ages, and not so many children to support, the economy has been able to boom. But they're looking to the future where these middle-aged people are going to be retiring. And so they're thinking, oh, well, maybe we'd better relax the one-child policy. So they have relaxed it. Whether the fertility rate is going up much is an open question that maybe it won't. Maybe they've gotten used to that kind of family.
Hello. Right here. Right behind Nan's head.
You need a
I'm
microphone.
hard of hearing, so you might have already answered some of the stuff that's implied in my question.
Yeah.
There's another side of population growth, that's population shrinkage. Actually, they're hurting in some countries because they don't have enough skilled workers to do the work in the native population, so they're having to import people from other countries. For example, Sharon and I were in Munich 2 years ago. There's one whole street there, nothing but Turks. Turks came in to get German jobs. And this is causing some problems in several countries. And the United States would like to get rid of all these Mexican immigrants. We tried it once. There wasn't anybody around to pick our crops for us. Those racist Southern growers then had to change their mind and say, okay, bring them back. So there's a lot of ways of looking at this.
Yeah, there's actually, I do have a, do I have it? Yeah, so yeah, you could say that there are these jobs that Americans are not willing to do, so we have to bring in immigrants who are willing to work for low wages. On the other hand, you could say if we don't bring them in, then the wages would rise, and if until their jobs got done, unless the jobs aren't important enough to get done, in which case maybe they wouldn't get done. Japan is not bringing in immigrants, and they're Japanese that are doing the the menial labor and doing the jobs. We have a lot of taxi drivers in this country who are immigrants. In Japan, the taxi drivers are Japanese, and they wear white gloves and they wear little hats that are official, and they are proud professionals. And they found a way to do it without bringing in immigrants. There is a recent book that I want to refer you to, if I can find it. Oh, this one, yeah, Philip Cafaro. Title, it's How Many is Too Many. It's called The Progressive Argument for Reducing Immigration into the United States. So he addresses all these questions and is arguing that it would be beneficial for the poor workers who are unemployed if we could restrict immigration. Particularly, there's this chain immigration of family members that's going on. It used to be that we were importing based on, or getting immigrants based on skills. That changed in 1965 to favoring family unification. What he argues is that the sort of large-scale relaxed immigration policies economically favors those whose income is from investments and does harm to those whose main income is from wages. Anyway, I can't say much about it because I'm not an expert on this topic, but I would refer you to his book, who has all the arguments on both sides and answers to those questions. Very readable book. Another one for your book club. Yeah. In fact, I'm organizing a book club in a couple of weeks at my house in Seattle about this book. Next.
Hi, my name is Sally. Excuse me. One of the reasons that perhaps the Chinese population has dwindled is because there are not many women left because of during the one-child policy, many of the female babies were disposed of so they could have a male child to raise. And then another thing is that the one-child policy was successful in the urban areas, but not actually out in the farm areas, because they couldn't police it out there very well. Anyway, that's my opinion.
Yeah, actually, yeah, I've been reading a fair amount about, in these latest books, about infanticide and where, well, of course, it's practiced a lot less now than it used to be. Apparently, it was quite widespread in many Aboriginal groups, probably because it's easier than abortion if you don't have modern medicine. Yeah, in many cases, it's preferentially the female babies that are killed. And certainly that's been happening in India and in China recently. In fact, it's, I guess as a result, I just, just what I read in the newspapers, that these, Chinese young men who are having a hard trouble finding a wife, they're bringing in, they're bringing in wives from Southeast Asia, bringing them up from Philippines or Thailand or somewhere, like Vietnam. I don't remember the countries, but yeah, so that's there's been a lot written about that, and the danger of having a large cohort of angry 20-year-olds, men who could cause big trouble for social disruption.